Well, greetings and salutations and welcome to the Newsman Weekly Podcast. It's hard to believe, but today we mark 2 months of these weekly little audio projects. Today is episode number 8. My thanks to the hundreds of people who download these podcasts each and every week, and it's been a lot of fun. We have a great show for you again this week. When we started this magical mystery tour, I told you these shows would have all kinds of guests. I'd get newsmakers, elected officials, appointed leaders. But I also told you, you know what, there's going to be days we're just going to talk with some really cool people. And we've got one of those guests this week. In a few minutes, I'll be joined by author and journalist Steve Goble. The Ashland resident has been nominated for a Seamus Award for Outstanding Achievement in Private Eye Fiction for his novel, Go Find Daddy. I worked with Steve for several years at the Mansfield News Journal. He is a brilliant writer and editor. I can't wait to learn more about his writing projects and just do some catching up with an old friend. And that's coming up after we talk about what's been a fairly wild week of local news. Joining me this week are Richland source Shelby/North Richland County reporter Hayden Gray, who's filling the producer role this week for the vacationing Zach Heiser. Good morning, Hayden, and thanks for being almost on time today.
Hey, thanks, Carl. I was just saying I hope viewership doesn't take a dip here these 2 weeks in a row that I'm on here. So we'll see. We'll look at the numbers next week.
Yeah, the Nielsen ratings are in, and we got some work to do. But we're also joined again by Knox Pages reporter Grant Ritchie, a young man whose title changes from week to week on this show based upon his successes and failures. We are planning on eventually doing a full-blown video of this show each week, and Richie has been tasked with making it happen. Honestly, it's a work in progress, but welcome back, Richie, and congratulations once again for being a somewhat important part of the hottest podcast in the world.
Thank you, Carl, for allowing me on the podcast once again. I think the video this time will work. We had some hiccups, some things that we need to work on, but I think this is the week, but don't hold me to it. But yeah, I think it'll drop tomorrow.
That just fills me with more confidence than you can possibly imagine, Richie. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's been a great, we just wrapped up a great week's worth of fun at the Richland County Fair on Saturday. Hope everybody got a chance to visit the fair. We certainly had daily coverage of it here at Richland Source. I know, Hayden, you were out there Saturday covering the kind of last animal event of the week. How did that go for you?
It was good. You know, I checked out the first time for me personally going to the Junior Fair Livestock Auction, and I can't complain too bad. Although it's a lengthy event, I kind of had the privilege of covering it the first year in the new show arena this year. So with air conditioning and fans, I can't complain too much.
And did you buy any particular animals, or you just kind of bid on everything as it came along?
I did not participate in the auction, but
okay, all right. Well,
but yeah, I gotta say, at first I was a little nervous. Once I heard how long it was gonna be, I'm like, that's a long time for any auctioneer. But then I learned, there's a rotation. But still, props to them. That's a long day.
I was really counting on you to bring back a pig so
sorry.
we could have some bacon and sausage and things like that. But our friends at the Ohio State Reformatory and Destination Mansfield Richland County put on one hell of a weekend. Multiple panel discussions with cast members from Shawshank Redemption, the iconic movie that was made here 30 years ago. Big weekend of celebrations of that. Lots of other film interactions on the Shawshank Trail. The 10th Shawshank Hustle, which is a 7K road race for walkers and runners. About 3,000 people walking and running in that event. I got to tell you, it's always fun. It's not the first time I've covered the hustle, and if you want a behind-the-scenes look at how you do this, the race starts and ends at the Ohio State Reformatory. So I get down there in the morning. I find someplace to park that's not going to be in the path of runners. I get pictures before the race. I get video of the start of the race. I then jump in my car, or to my car as quick as I can, take the back roads to drive uptown to try to get the runners once they get into town as they're coming through Central Park. So had a couple of people as they came by said, "Didn't I see you at the start?" I said, "Yes, you did." "How did you get here so fast?" I said, "I didn't run." So that's kind of the whole key to that. But I covered a lot of the Shawshank events, wrote stories, took pictures. I even did a video or two for Instagram and the TikTok I don't know a lot about Snapbook and InstaFace, but I do what I do. I got to ask, you guys are both relatively young compared to me. If I had socks on, they'd be older than you. But have either of you seen the movie Shawshank Redemption?
Yes, I saw it a couple years ago, and I really enjoyed it. It's kind of long, but but I enjoyed it. I'm a big Stephen King fan too, and I didn't know originally that he wrote the kind of the framing of the book. So that was interesting. I'm wondering with you, Carl, though. I mean, if you talk to anyone there, either at the run, walk, or the screening panel discussions, did you talk to anyone who traveled a long distance to see that wasn't either from the county or from Ohio that went to it?
I don't know how far people came. There was a question asked Friday night during the panel discussion before they actually showed the movie on the Renaissance big screen. They said, how many people are here from Mansfield? And there was not a huge amount of applause. I think people, I don't know where they all come from, but there were thousands of people who made the trip here for this particular 30th anniversary weekend. I know I talked to Bob Gunton, who played Warden Norton, and this is the second or third time he's come back for this. And he said to him, when he talks to people, it's not a religious experience, but it's spiritual. And he said it's almost a pilgrimage for people to want to come back to where this movie was made. And yeah, when you saw it, did you ever imagine, I'm going to be working someday in the community where this movie was made?
No, I did know that it was filmed in Mansfield, and I've gone through the haunted prison once when I was a teenager, and so that was cool.
Were you scared?
Yeah, because there's that one part where it's like almost like a little corridor, and you don't really have a lot of wiggle room, and it is pitch black, and I was just like waiting for like a hand to come out and grab me.
Well, a couple of times that I worked out there in the haunted prison as an actor, I was in that dark maze. And you're right, you really can't see your hand in front of your face. And I remember one night I was out there and I got this scary mask on, and man and his wife, girlfriend, not sure, I didn't have the opportunity to ask what the status of their relationship was. But I let him walk right up on me, and I had this like mag light that I held under my chin, and when they were really close, I popped this light on so you just see this scary face in the dark. Well, the woman shrieked and kind of fell back, and her husband, who I think probably should have played in the NFL at some point, throws a very well-placed elbow, and it clipped me right in the chin. And I went down in just a big pile.
Yeah.
And as they were stepping over me to continue on the haunt, I looked up and I said, dude, it's a haunted house. If you don't want to be scared, don't come in here. Right. And they didn't say anything. They just kept going.
Collecting the dust.
Next morning, I looked in the mirror, and it was even scarier than normal, even with the mask on. What about you, Hayden? Have you seen the movie?
I have seen the movie. I've seen it many a times, whether all the way through or bits and pieces as it's on television. But, yeah.
Now, what year were you born?
1998.
Okay, so the movie was made 5 years before you were born, so you're not an extra or anything in the movie?
No. Nope, I had no shot at that.
All right, and what's your favorite part of the Shawshank Redemption?
My favorite part is probably when he starts digging the hole to get out, and then because that's kind of that whole sequence is kind of a slow burn.
Well, it's 2.5 hours.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean,
everything's a slow burn.
You don't know exactly what he's doing in the beginning, I guess, but then. And then like them going through the hole and the tunnel and seeing everything, and of course like the famous beach scene at the end is just like so moving. But yeah,
it was interesting when I was talking with Frank Darabont, the director and screenwriter for Shawshank. That beach scene was not how he wanted the movie to end originally. His idea originally was it would end with Red on the bus on his way to perhaps reuniting with his friend. But the folks at Castle Rock and the producer said, look, why don't you film the beach scene? Go ahead and shoot it, and then if you like it, use it. If you don't, we'll leave it up to you. And he said they went ahead and they filmed it. And when he got together with his film editor, they looked at it, and he said he only had to see it one time. And he said, yep, that's the ending. He goes, there's no doubt that's how this movie's going to end now. But what about you, Hayden? What was your favorite part of Shawshank?
I always like, and I'm a little bit particular to this moment in the movie, but when Andy finally, he's gotten out, wiggles his way out and reaches the rain and the storm and puts his arms out, because my father actually, who's also a big Shawshank fan, did a painting of that particular scene. And so I'm always a little bit particular to that portion of the film.
I also like the Brooke Steph scene when he gets out of prison. And it's kind of like almost like a short film in a way. You're just like going through his life and seeing how it's very difficult for him to readjust out of prison, and then he eventually takes his own life.
Wait, what? Wait, spoiler alert.
Sorry.
I mean, maybe there's people that haven't seen this.
How old is the movie?
Jeez. Oh,
The movie
man.
is very old.
Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're going to redo that whole thing, and this time you're not going to say
Okay.
Brooks Hadlin killed him. I'm just kidding.
Okay.
I just like giving you a hard time. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's in when I talked to Ben Mankiewicz, the TV journalist and the guy who hosts Turner Classic Movies. That's one of his favorite scenes. Is that whole 4-minute sequence with James Whitmore, amazing actor who also narrates that part of his story himself. And if you can watch that and hear him talk about that bird, hoping, he said, I forget the bird's name now. I've watched the movie. I just watched the movie again over the weekend. But he hopes that bird will come back someday while he's feeding the other birds in the park. He goes, but
Jake,
thank you. He goes, but he never does. And I'm like, oh, man. Yeah. But, okay. Enough. What'd you guys do this week? I know I worked all weekend, but what'd you guys do for fun?
we had the Mount Vernon Music and Arts Festival this weekend, so me and my coworker Cheryl Splain, we were there over the weekend taking photos, and I think she did a story about a pie contest there, and they had a flower show and other things, and the mayor gave a key to the city too, and I'm not sure if you heard of the band Lone Star. They were the main act Saturday night.
Yes, they played at the Wren a couple of years ago when I did a preview story, and they were like a huge band, I think in the 90s, I think.
Yeah, they had a couple of top tens on the charts, and we had a good sized crowd. Beautiful weather, it was 70s and clear skies. It was, I mean, you really couldn't ask for better weather.
At any point in the festival, did Phil Dirt and the Dozers play?
Yes.
Of course they did. You cannot have a music festival in Mount Vernon without Phil Dirt.
Yeah.
I've only been down there a couple of times over the years, but it's probably the fourth generation of Phil Dirt and the Dozers. Some of these guys they've been doing this a really long time.
Well, I mean, that festival's been going on for decades too, so yeah, that makes sense.
What about you, Hayden?
Well, Carl, you know how my Saturday went. I mean, I spent that out at the Richland County Fairgrounds. I think that we actually spoke for a little bit, trying to hear one another.
Yes.
I had accidentally called Carl, and he called back and couldn't quite understand what I was trying to say. But
all I could hear was sold.
Sure. So
that's my best auctioneer impersonation. Just garbled and deal sold.
So I came home from that Saturday, got a story churned, and just relaxed the rest of the evening. And then yesterday, just included some more yard work. That never stops.
Yard work. You gotta love yard work.
Never stops.
I mowed my yard yesterday because my wife refused to do it again, so I had to take matters into my own hands for once. But
good man.
Anyway, that's enough about the weekend. Before we get to my friend Steve Goble and talk about his novels that he's writing, let's talk about some local news. Mansfield City Council has begun its discussions of proposed zoning regulations and rules for potential recreational cannabis dispensaries in the city. As we record this on Monday morning, I'm planning to cover a special council meeting this evening when they're going to go over these ordinances for the first time in a public session. There should be a story about it on today's website, i.e. Tuesday, unless something has gone technologically wrong or council didn't do what I thought they were going to do. I did write a story last Thursday when the proposed regulations were announced. Here's a couple of highlights. Dispensaries will be allowed only in B2 general business zones, and there'll be a maximum of 4 dispensaries allowed. Not saying we're going to have 4, but at least with this legislation, unless council changes it, there'll be a maximum of 4. Now, why was a special meeting tonight? It's because last Tuesday when council met, Some members were not happy that this legislation was not ready for them to discuss last week. So on Wednesday, 3 of them asked for a special session tonight because they want to get this thing rolling. The regulations were not available Tuesday. They came out on Thursday, and there'll be a pretty good public discussion tonight, I would suspect, at 6:30 up at the municipal building. Let's see, what else we got going on? Oh, one of the things I want to tell you, and I think I mentioned this before, it's going to be in a B2 district. And according to current zoning rules in the city, a B2 district is to provide for more diversified business establishments which are not generally located adjacent to residential neighborhoods. These districts contain shopping areas which are community-wide or regional in nature and should be served by state highways or at least 4-lane streets. One of the things I'm told is going to happen tonight is they're going to be able to put a GIS map up on the screen to clearly identify where these B2 districts are and perhaps where these dispensaries may eventually be located. They ever going to have a cannabis dispensary in Mount Vernon, Richie?
No, in my personal opinion, not with the current administration. I don't think.
Hayden, Shelby already said no to all this, didn't they?
Yeah, correct. I'm blanking on the particular date when that happened, but a few months ago, correct. They did put in a ban that no dispensaries would be setting up within the city limits.
We've ruled out medical there already. In Mount Vernon.
All right. Well, the other big news for me last week also came out of City Council. A longtime developer came to City Council on Tuesday. He owns the Brass Office Center, which used to be the Ohio Brass Administration Building at 380 North Main Street. There was a public hearing. He wanted to obtain historic status for the century-old building, a move that would make that building eligible for federal tax incentives and credits. Council delayed a vote on his request until August 20th after they told Bob Myers that his Lawyers Development Corporation owes $84,000 in back property taxes on that property. The vote was 6-1. The only person who didn't vote to delay the vote was David Falquette, a at-large councilman. So the bombshell then came the next morning, actually later on that same day. It was on Wednesday. Mr. Myers notified the city, I'm going to pay my property taxes, but I'm not going forward with this whole plan. So basically got kind of messy real fast. I'm told by the end of the week there are efforts trying to get the project back on track, but we'll see. Myers wanted to have the building designated historic, getting him those credits, and his idea was to convert the 5-story brick building into 82 to 84 apartments, and those tax credits and incentives would make it more cost feasible. But for now, the Ohio Brass Building, what's known as the Brass Office Center, shall remain in its current vacant status. All right. We also got the latest on a $17 million Main Street corridor improvement project. This has been in the works for a few years now. On Tuesday, Council gave their final legislative approvals. This project will soon go out to bid. City Engineer Bob Bianchi said he hopes to begin work as soon as February. It won't be done until October 2026. By that point, Hayden, you'll be covering City Council, so you'll be able to cover the ending of this. It's going to be done in stages to reduce impact on traffic and businesses, but it's a big project. It's taken an awful lot of time. Wrote some stories about that. If you want any more information about it, please come to the website. And now just a note on one of the really cool stories of the past week, written by sports reporter Kurt Conrad. It's all about a woman named Missy Blake. She graduated from Clear Fork in 1994. She is a military veteran. She's a longtime runner, and she had a goal of conquering Everest, and she did that. She became the first veteran amputee to run the Mount Everest Half Marathon on May 29th. She completed the 21-kilometer course, and I am not going to begin to try to pronounce the names of these communities where it started and finished. But she finished in 9 hours and 44 minutes and 1 second. Kurt wrote that the fact that she even started the race on the world's tallest peak is a testament to Blake's fortitude. She had a portion of her left foot amputated in 2023. She competed on a broken foot. She qualified and was planning to run the 70-kilometer ultramarathon, but had to withdraw from the longer race after falling and breaking 2 bones in her left foot days before the race. She was encouraged to pull out entirely, but she convinced a doctor to let her compete in the shorter race. And she told Kurt, quote, "I was one of 6 people on the mountain who qualified for the ultra and the only woman. The goal was to be the first disabled veteran to ever run the ultra and the second American woman to run the ultra and the 10th woman on earth to run the ultra." So congratulations to Clear Fork High School graduate Missy Blake for a great effort on Mount Everest. Have you ever seen Mount Everest, Hayden?
I think I just scrolling through TikTok last night was seeing some Everest clips and like the most top 10 dangerous climbs in the world, and that's insane.
Yeah, I don't think this particular marathon took them to the top, because
Sure.
I think you have to have oxygen and all that kind of stuff. I mean, to get to that amount of rarefied air, that's where folks like Richie thrive, right? I mean, if you were going to the top of Everest, you'd be planting your flag. And
Yeah, I've been there many a times.
okay, well, very good. All right, well, that's enough for now. Let's take a break, and when we come back, I will be joined by author and journalist Steve Goble, and we will discuss his 7th novel. And it's Steve is a wonderful guy, and it's going to be a great conversation. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Well, welcome back to the Newsman Weekly. As promised, my guest this week is author and journalist Steve Goble from Ashland. He was recently nominated for a National Fiction Writing Award for his latest novel, Go Find Daddy. Welcome, sir. It is great to see you again. It's been a few years.
It's been too long, Carl.
It has. As I said earlier, Steve and I worked together at the Mansfield News Journal for several years. In those days, Steve worked primarily as a copy editor, along with his wife, Jerry. Before we talk about your latest literary effort, there's something I want to say about my work with Steve. And I want folks in the journalism world to hear this. I've been doing this kind of work for more than 40 years. And Steve Goble is the best pure editor of type I ever worked with. There's some folks I work with now who think I can do an okay job at that. And grammar and spelling are one thing. Lots of folks I've worked with over the years are good at that. There's a lot of AI crap out there these days that'll help you with that. Steve, however, was the best at finding holes in stories, spotting unanswered questions, and arranging the story in a way that made the most sense. And if you were a reporter, you wanted Steve to be the guy that edited your story, because when a reader reads the newspaper and says, I wonder what happened here, or why didn't they ask this question? This is the guy that made sure your story went well. For example, we did probably the most expansive project at the News Journal, at least when I was involved. There was a thing called Who Killed Corey Jones. It was really long. We took a young sports writer named Rob McCurdy, who was a great storyteller, and had him do it. There's 25 different parts to all of this, but what do you recall most about that, good or bad, about daily print journalism, Steve, way back in the day when we were doing this?
Well, first of all, let me say about Rob McCurdy's Corey Jones series, I didn't have to work too damn hard on that. That was some of the finest news writing that came across my desk in my entire career. And with Rob, a few commas here and there, he had problems with which and that. But organizing the story and telling the story, he was a natural.
But there were some other parts of that we had some sidebars and things like that, and there was just a lot of work involved. I mean, we, as an organization, the News Journal won a pretty significant Gannett Award back at that time, but there were some other parts of that, because when we started the project, I told Tom Brennan, who was the publisher, I said, look, I need one person to be editing all of this, because there's a lot of moving parts. We got sidebars here, we got sidebars there, we got main bars. When you're working on a project like that, how do you kind of juggle all the balls and focus and help me make sure that this thing's coming across in the way that we wanted it to?
It was a challenge because we were talking about print journalism. We weren't online, where you could make things pop up wherever you wanted and you didn't have to worry about making it fit. So that was a big part of it. You had to make sure you weren't wasting words. You were getting to the point, and fortunately with Rob, that wasn't a problem. But with all of the sidebars and things like that, you wanted to try to make sure that they appeared on the page at about the point where those questions or that information was going to be relevant. If he was talking about the early part of the story, you wanted to make sure that the sidebars relevant to that part of the story were in that place. And you wanted to make sure the headlines on those told the reader, this is the information you were wondering about 2 seconds ago when you read that paragraph. It's kind of subtle. It's a challenge, and I kind of actually miss doing that. It's sort of like a Rubik's Cube.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the part of journalism I liked best, was taking good work from other people and trying to make it shine and make it work for the readers.
I remember when we got that award, and some folks outside of the News Journal congratulated me for the award, and I said, you have no idea. I said, other than suggesting the folks who should actually do the work, I had little or no involvement. I just found the right people, and I think that was the whole key. All right.
You found us the time to do it, too. You kept other things out of the way so we could concentrate on that. So, juggling is important, too.
Well, see, middle management has always been my goal in life, and, I think I succeeded there. But, all right, let's back up a little bit. Tell us about yourself, Steve, your background, why you got into journalism in the first place. And I promise you, we're going to get to the novel stuff, but I feel like I got to set the stage for it.
Sure, no problem. Well, honestly, I got into journalism partly through literature. I've always been an avid reader. I used to get yelled at by my mom. I would go to the public library and come back with a grocery bag full of books, and she'd say, you could just bring home 2 or 3 and then go back a few days later. But, so I was always reading, and I fell in love with the written word at a very young age. And it was because I read so much. I think that's what helped me develop as a writer, and it's what made me want to tell stories, either real ones or fictional ones. They both count. And I always had a facility with words, at least when I was writing them. Speaking them, as your audience is about to find out, is often a different ballgame. But I fell in love with books. I fell in love with stories. And I originally went to college with the idea of becoming a lawyer, because I always liked to argue.
And that is so weird, because that's what I was going to do. I was going to get a journalism degree and go to law school,
Mm-hmm.
but after 4 years, I was more than broke and more than tired of school.
Well, yeah, it was a little different for me. I went to Ohio State, and the journalism program there was set up so that you could take a lot of different elective courses.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took courses in government, and I took courses in criminal justice. That was my minor. And I liked that program the way it was set up. But while I was working on the Lantern and writing stories and editing stories and mostly talking to the other kinds of people who are attracted to journalism, I really fell in love with that. And by the time I graduated, law school was just off the table. I didn't have the desire to do that anymore. I wanted to work in journalism, wanted to work with words.
So talk a little bit about your start in journalism. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it was at the Fremont News Messenger back in the day.
Yeah, Roy Wilhelm, who was the managing editor at the time there, came to Ohio State and did interviews with students, one of whom was me. And I somehow convinced him that at that tender young age I could possibly do a job as a reporter. And he hired me first as an education reporter and eventually as a police reporter. I did that for a couple of years, and we eventually decided that this guy seems to be a pretty decent wordsmith. He's pretty good at organizing things and stuff like that, but maybe not send him out to talk to people so much.
That wasn't something that you necessarily enjoyed most, the actual going out and interviewing and doing that kind of reporting stuff.
No, I'm kind of stereotypical novelist in that way. Going out and talking to people, not my favorite thing in the world to do. But organizing stories, writing stories, telling stories, sitting at a desk for a while and typing it all out, I could do that all day.
See, that's interesting. You and I, Steve and I, talked a little bit right before we turned on the microphones, and I guess the journalism world has a home for just about everybody because I was and still am the exact opposite. And this always surprises people when I tell them, and I don't know if I've said this on this podcast yet, but I actually don't like to write. I mean, writing itself is such a lonely, damn, live in your own head kind of work. I like to report. I like to dig through records. I like to do interviews. But then when I sit down and it's just me and this stupid laptop and it's a blank page, I'm like, I don't like this. I like to have written.
Mm-hmm.
I like to go back and read something that I wrote and said, oh, that's pretty damn good.
Yeah.
But the process is just so painful for me. And I think it's the exact opposite for you.
It really is. First of all, I spend a lot of time in my head anyway. I'm one of those people who has an internal dialogue all the time. If I'm sitting in a chair with my eyes closed, if I'm awake, I'm thinking and words are rolling through my head. But it was funny what you said about sitting in front of a blank page. I actually can't do that. I don't sit down to write until I know what I'm going to write. A lot of my actual writing gets done while I'm on my tractor mowing my lawn or driving down the road. I occasionally will miss an exit because I'm thinking about a plot line.
But Jerry loves that.
Well, she teases me about it all the time, and she's well aware of my tendencies in this direction. But a lot of writers will tell you have a certain time of day that you sit down and begin writing. Do it every day, blah, blah, blah. I'm not that guy. Once I know what I want to write, I can sit down and bang out 1,000 words in 20 minutes. But to sit there without an idea of what's this next scene, what has to happen, I can't do that at all. I'll wander around the house and look like a lost, lonely old man. But the books eventually do get written.
So when you made the decision to become a novelist, I mean, what was there an epiphany in your head that said, I've loved books growing up. I've been involved in writing and creating things my entire life. Now it's time for me to actually sit down and write a novel. Is it something you always considered doing? I mean, how did you find a publisher? Where did that whole thing come from?
Well, as far as the decision to try to be a novelist, that was probably made when I was 12 or 13. Real life got in the way, in terms of getting an education, paying the bills, getting married, having a kid, a few dogs, and everything else. But I always knew I wanted to do that. That was always in the back of my head. And I had made some progress along those lines. I started various books, finished some. They weren't very good, but I learned in the process of doing that. At one point, I found myself between jobs, a lot of changes in journalism, et cetera, et cetera. So,
just a few here and there.
Just a few. But I found myself between jobs with at least a nice severance to get me through a period. So while I was looking for work, Jerry said, "You know what? Take the severance, take the time. You'll land on your feet. You'll find another job. In the meantime, you're going to finish your book." And she was right. So she gets as much credit for any of this as I do because she believed when I didn't necessarily believe, but she did.
Well, it's interesting. I was talking that you were talking about kind of had written some stuff before, and it wasn't, in your words anyway, it wasn't any good or wasn't very good. And over the weekend when I was interviewing Frank Darabont, who directed and wrote the screenplay for Shawshank Redemption, I asked him, I said, you bought the rights to that from Stephen King for $5,000. By the way, Stephen King never cashed that check. He later sent it back to Darabont in a frame. But I said, you bought it and you let it sit for 5 years. I said, what were you waiting for? And he goes, I needed to be a better writer.
Yeah.
He says, I wasn't ready to write that screenplay when I got the rights to it. I needed to get better as a writer.
Yeah, a lot of writers are their own worst critics, for one thing. And a lot of writers have what they call imposter syndrome. Is I can't really be as good at this as people keep telling me I am. And I'm one of those, frankly. My agent tells me that you're way better at this than you think you are. And I said, well, I'm just glad I have an agent. But yeah, you feel like you learn with every book. I look back at my first novel, the one that broke me into this, and when I try to read it now, I'm like, why the hell did I write it this way? Because I've learned things in the process of each book. That's why I think the newest one is probably my best. But yeah, I totally know what Frank's talking about. That, you know, I've finished short stories and thought about sending them off to magazines or whatever, and then no, this isn't ready. Yeah. And then maybe 5-6 years later, I find it in a drawer and I barely remember having written it, and I read it and say, okay, there's some good stuff here. Maybe I can fix it.
Yeah. Well, I've been a writer for as long as I can remember. I cannot imagine for a second sitting down and writing a novel. I don't have the patience for it. I don't have the talent for it. Now, tell me about your writing process itself. You've written 7 novels already. I think it's 7, at least published novels. And I remember one of my favorite authors was a guy named Shelby Foote, historian. He wrote a 3-part series on the Civil War that took years and years, and he wrote it with a dip pen. He would literally sit down with a dip pen, and he said he would write a page and then set it aside to dry. And once it was dry, if he liked it, he'd hand it to somebody to actually type it. But, I mean, talk about your writing process itself. How do you work best when it comes to writing your novels?
Well, I I don't write them by pen. I would never have the patience to do that. But I know of other writers who swear by that because it slows them down and it makes them think about each word and each sentence. Whereas at a keyboard, you might just type crap and not realize it's crap until you read it hours later.
I do that every day.
I've done that a few times too. But I wrote all of my books on an iPad. Some of them without a Bluetooth keyboard connected to it. In other words, the little pop-up keyboard on the screen. Mm-hmm. That's what I used. I'm not the fastest typist in the world. I use my 2 middle fingers and my thumb.
I have my index fingers. So yeah.
Well, the middle fingers are longer, so I don't have to bend anything. They also have other functions.
Yes, they do.
But I wrote them all on iPad, partly because of the convenience. I mean, I wrote parts of some of my books at the Phoenix with a beer and an iPad while I was on a break from my job at the News Journal.
Don't tell anybody, but I covered a sports game. I think it was a baseball game once, and I wrote the game story at the Fox. I'm just saying, it's possible to write in those environments.
Of course, and sometimes it's beneficial, too.
Yes.
The Phoenix has great beers, and they're inspirational. I named a ship after one of their IPAs in one of my pirate books. But the iPad makes it convenient. If we're traveling or something like that, I could still have everything with me and work on the book. But my process is basically, we already talked about, riding around on the tractor and thinking about what the next chapter is going to be. Once I know what that is, I sit down, and once I get started, I go pretty well until I reach the next stopping point. And that might be half hour and a half at the keyboard, then get up and wander around, hang out with my family. Another idea comes up. If I know what I'm going to do, I'll go back to the keyboard. I rarely write more than 2,000 to 3,000 words at a time. It's almost like writing a series of news columns or whatever. Mm-hmm. But eventually, if you keep doing it, the book gets done.
So when you start a book, and this is part of the reason that I'll never do one, because I'm terrible at outlining things. Do you know in your head, here's where it's going to begin, and here's how it's going to end, and I just got to fill in the middle?
Exactly. I can't start until I know where we're starting from, where it's going to end, and I also have to have a pretty good idea of who all the characters are that the protagonist is going to meet along the way. It's that part in the middle is the hard part, because everything has to make sense. And you have to know, well, okay, I know where I'm going, but how do I get there? And how do I make sure the reader comes along with me? And occasionally I'll hit a sticking point. So, all right, my hero in this book is a detective. There's a clue he needs to get, but he can't connect those dots right now, because if he connects them right now, the book's over and we're done.
It's a short story.
And I need to put him through hell first.
Yeah.
I have to get him in trouble, get him shot at a few times, throw in a car chase or whatever. So how do I present this clue so that the reader has it and my detective has it, but the lights don't necessarily go off yet? Or how do I present something that looks like a clue and leads the reader astray, but then make it make sense later when they realize, oh no, that wasn't clue, that was wrong. Those are the parts that drive me nuts. Those are the parts that send me wandering through the house like an old man. But once I know what to do, I sit down and boom, bang that out until I get to the next sticking point.
Now, one of the things we're talking about today is Steve's latest novel. It's called Go Find Daddy. It's the third in the Ed Runyon series. It's been nominated for a Seamus Award by the Private Eye Writers of America. Now, for those not familiar with the work, the main character, as Steve mentioned earlier, is Ed Runyon, who left the New York City Police Department to work as a detective for a sheriff's office in rural Ohio. So describe for us what Runyon is up to in this book. I think he's left the sheriff's office to become a private detective. Mm-hmm. Without giving away the plot line, what's Ed doing in this book?
No, in this book, Ed's grown up a little bit. If anyone's read the first two books, City Problems was the first Ed Runyon book. In that one, he was a sheriff's detective and got into a fairly traumatic investigation of a young woman's murder. He had some anger management issues. He had some maturity issues, and ended up at the end of that book leaving that job. Just the stress was getting to him too much. In the second book, his wayward son. He goes off looking for a young boy who's gotten himself into trouble in an online sextortion scheme. I don't know if your listeners know much about that kind of thing, but people do things online that they don't want other people to know they're doing, and sometimes it gets them into a lot of trouble. But Ed's working through his issues. He likes working for himself. He likes being able to take the cases he wants to take. He's kind of getting his love life straightened out a little bit in that book. In this one, Go Find Daddy, which is, I call this one my grown-up book because I feel like I've come a long way as a writer, and I'm maybe finally figuring out how to do this after 6 previous books. He's working for himself. He's got his anger management issues largely under control. He feels like he's got things together, and then in this case, he's asked by a woman to go find her husband, who is suspected of killing a police officer and going off the grid afterward. Her husband is a very anti-government, anti-police type of guy. He writes a blog about how officers of the law are really just jackbooted thugs.
So this is kind of like modern day.
There's
a lot of people out there.
There are a lot of people who agree with Donnie Blackman's positions on these things, yes. But in any case, when the book starts, the murder is already 3 months in the past. And every police officer and agency in the country is looking for this guy because everyone thinks he killed a cop. His gun was there. His fingerprints were on the gun. But this woman asks Ed, can you find my husband? And he doesn't want to take the case. First of all, he doesn't like the guy. Ed's an ex-cop. And this guy hates cops, He doesn't want to do it. And everyone else is looking for the guy anyway. He's like, what am I supposed to do that, the rest of the law enforcement can't do? And she tells him, well, I don't want you to find him and bring him in. I just want you, I'm going to give you a letter. I just want you to get this letter to him. And what it is his daughter has been diagnosed with brain cancer. He doesn't know it.
Oh.
And his wife wants Ed to find him, to tell him, and all this is in the first chapter of the book, so
okay.
There's no spoilers here. To find her husband and tell him, your little girl's maybe dying, and you need to find a way to get home and see her. And Ed has a soft spot for kids. It was cases in New York involving kids that turned out badly that led to all of his anger management issues. So once he hears that, he's like, well, hell, look, I got to take this case. And so then the rest of the book is how do you find a man who won't use a phone, won't use a credit card, won't touch a computer, won't tell his best friends or even his wife where he is.
Yeah.
And Ed has to go and try to track him down.
It's interesting. As journalists, we are taught or we learn how to listen to people and quote people. We tell stories, but when it comes to actual verbiage, we leave that to others. How hard is it for you, or how hard was it for you to create dialogue, to write actual dialogue between people? Because that's not something that you and I, at least from a professional standpoint, grew up doing.
Well, yeah, you're right about that. In journalism, you don't want to put words in people's mouth, and when you're writing fiction, you have to. But actually, most of my readers, the people who've edited my novels, and my agent tell me dialogue is my strength. And I think part of that comes from, in journalism, you don't put words in people's mouth, but you sure as hell have to listen to how they talk.
Mm-hmm.
And in listening to how they talk, as a journalist, you're not just looking for what are they saying, but you're looking for what they're not saying and trying to figure a way to get them to say it in many cases.
Yeah.
But you pick up on how people talk to one another and the words they use, and that kind of thing. And I think that informs the dialogue in my books. I've always listened to other people pretty well. Most of my friends, and I'm not going to do this on the air, but most of my friends will know that I have a little bit of a knack for accents and mimicry. Nothing on a Rich Little level or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I can do that kind of thing because I've always listened to people a lot. So, yeah, writing dialogue, that part comes naturally to me.
Well, I can see your connection to a character like Ed Runyon. I mean, you and I both know something about writing about rural Ohio law enforcement. But Spider John, a reluctant pirate in the 1700s, we are one hell of a long way from the ocean, my friend. So that was your first series. That was your first thing. So where did your ideas for a pirate come from?
Well, that one was... when that light finally went off in my head, I wondered why it took so long. But when I was a kid, one of the very first books I read and fell in love with was Treasure Island, Robert Louis Stevenson. And, you got Long John Silver, you got pirates, you got Jim Hawkins, adventure on the seas, and they've got muskets and swords. And I just loved that book. I tracked down every pirate book I could find after that. Somewhere in there, though, I also read Hound of the Baskervilles, Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, adventure, mystery, crime, clues, and all of that. And somewhere along the line, way longer than it should have taken, it occurred to me, well, why don't I take these two things I really love and see if I can put them together?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I had this idea, I was playing in a garage band called 4 Lane High with some of my friends.
For those who don't know it, Steve Goble is also an accomplished bass player.
No, I'm a barely adequate bass player.
All right. Well, I can't even read music, so to me, you're an accomplished bass player.
I play by ear, but in any case, I can read the notes because I grew up learning how to play the drums, but the scale up and down, I can't read that. But in any case, we were getting together and just playing at a farm down in southern Ohio. And I looked at my friend Devin Atkinson, who was our singer, and I said, what do you think of this? Pirate murder mystery. And his eyes went boom. And once I saw that reaction from him, I thought, okay, this can really work. And it was the same case once I started selling books and people would come to get them signed and things like that. You'd go to a book event and you'd have your books on the table and people come by and they look, what is this? And you tell them, it's a pirate murder mystery. And I got two kinds of reactions. I either got the Devin reaction where the eyes would widen and they're like, yeah, okay. Or and I'd get the, huh? And they would just kind of move on to the next table.
Thanks for sharing that. What else? Move on.
Exactly. But in any case, that's how it started. And even though it's kind of a niche product, there are not a million people out there looking for pirate murder mysteries. It was different. Nobody else had written something like that. And so that's what helped me land an agent. If I had started writing private eye novels, lots of people write private eye novels. And, the question from the agents would have been, well, what makes yours different from somebody else's? Why don't I just go read Raymond Chandler instead of reading Steve Goble? But with pirate murder mysteries, no one else was doing it. And for those people whose eyes light up like Devin's did, somebody had to do it. So that poor bastard was me.
Well, it must have worked because there's been 3 more after that. Now, you obviously like series work when it comes to books. I think there's 4 parts to Spider John. Ed Runyon's now in his 3rd. I mean, what do you like about series work and novels? And is it because do you come up with new ideas after the first one's done, or when you get done with one, do you think, there's meat on this bone that I haven't eaten yet? Where does that come from?
Well, part of it comes from having read a lot of series. I've read mystery novels forever, and a lot of those are series books. Now, they're not series books like Lord of the Rings, where you have to read all 3 books to get the full story. It's more you have the same characters or the same core characters in your book, but they go and solve a different crime in the next book and so forth. But Sherlock Holmes was that way. There was a lot of short stories with Sherlock Holmes. Nero Wolfe was an eccentric New York detective. I think Rex Stout, I don't know how many of those books, 50 of that kind of thing. So I read a lot of series. So I always had that kind of in mind. When I wrote the Bloody Black Flag, which was the first Spider John book, I didn't really think of it in terms of a series at that point. I knew it was a possibility, but I didn't have a second story in line. It was just sort of an idea out there in the background. But when I started talking with agents, which is a whole nother ballgame, but I talked to Evan Marshall, who is my current agent, and it's the only agent I've ever had. One of the first questions he asked me was, do you have more Spider John books? And I said, well, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
And so he said, okay, well, look, I think you have a good idea here. I think I can sell this, but I'm going to need you to outline at least 1 or 2 more books for the future, and that'll help me sell it. Mm-hmm. And I said, sure. When do you need it? He said, well, as soon as you can get it to me. So I spent the rest of the next couple of days trying to come up with ideas for at least 1 or 2 more books. And the second idea was a locked room murder mystery aboard a pirate ship. It wasn't actually a pirate ship at the time. It was a commercial ship in the process of becoming a pirate ship. Mm-hmm. So that idea came fairly quickly, but then I said, what am I going to do for the 3rd book? And I told Evan that. I said, well, I have a sort of a vague idea for the 3rd book. And he said, well, just make it sound good now. You can change both of these ideas a million times once we have a contract. Right now we're trying to get a contract. So there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors going on in the publishing business. But so that's how that became a series. Now with Ed Runyon, one of the books, I'd actually started working on this character. He had a different name at the time when I was in college.
Wow.
The plot for the 2nd book and the first book was an idea I'd been carrying around in my head since college. But I always knew that was going to be a series. So when I started trying to sell that one, I had things outlined pretty well. But yeah, the first one was the agent says, "Can you do it?"
Yeah,
sure I can.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I always love those kinds of questions. The first, when I was getting ready to start college at OU, the Cambridge Daily Jeffersonian had a new young sports editor named Jim Crummell, who you and I both, I think, at some point he was in Mansfield and he hired me here. But I had applied for a sports editing job months before that. And he found it in the drawer when he took over, and he called me and he said, "Hey, will you be interested in covering sports? And I said, well, yeah, I was, but I'm going to OU this fall. And he goes, well, can you come back and forth on weekends? I said, every weekend? He goes, yeah. I said, okay. So we finished this interview, and he said, okay, I'm going to hire you. Do you know how to take pictures? Well, I mean, I'd taken pictures with a Kodak Instamatic. I said, yeah. He goes, great. First job, I want you to go down to Byesville, Meadowbrook today and get a picture of football practice. He goes, get a camera out of the case over there and go down. So he went back to doing what he was doing, and I walked over to this bin, and there's all these strange-looking cameras sitting there. And Ed Karras was a photographer, and he walked over, and he looked at me, and he looked in the case, and he said, you told him you could take pictures, didn't you? I said, yeah. He goes, never have you? And I said, no. He goes, well, here, I'm going to put some film in this, and I'm going to adjust this for the light you're going to have today. Don't touch anything. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So I love those kinds. Oh, yeah, I've got like 5 books in my head right now.
Sometimes you have to push yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit in order to find success.
Exactly. Now, Steve, where can people find your books? I mean, obviously, probably Amazon or things like that.
Yeah, they're on Amazon or any bookstore. A lot of times, independent bookstores, if you go and say, do you have this book? If they have it, great. If they don't, they'll get it for you. I've never gone into a bookstore in my life and not have them say, well, no, we can order this for you. Also, another thing is check your library. Mm-hmm. I know most of the books were in the libraries at one point. Now, the pirate books maybe have come and gone by now, but I know in Ashland, a couple of them are still there. But if you ask your library to get the book for you, they'll either find a library that has it and borrow it, mm-hmm. or most of the time they just order it for you anyway. Libraries and librarians are the best places and people on this planet. They're evidence that people still think.
That's always good.
But they will help you get the books.
All right, so what comes next? Do you have a plan to continue either of these series, or do you have something else completely different in mind at this point?
Right now, I'm working on a different kind of detective novel where I'm trying to go for a more humorous, kind of a comical approach, and not so much grim, bloody bullets flying mm-hmm. That we have in the Ed Runyon books, partly because I don't want to write the same books over and over again. I succeeded with Spider John. I did something that other people hadn't done. I proved it could be done. But I wanted to try something else, and I did. And so now I don't even have a name for this detective yet, mm-hmm. but he plays bass in a garage band.
Oh, go figure.
But people don't like him enough. He's not in a band, actually. He just kind of fills in wherever a bass player is needed for a weekend or two. He does stand-up comedy here and there. He has trouble holding down a real job is the problem.
That's it.
And he got into being a private detective because his uncle was a private detective. And he thought, well, I could set my own hours and whatever. Unlike Ed is built like an NFL tight end. He's a trained sniper. He can fight his way out of situations and doesn't worry too much about confrontation. He's trained to handle it. This new detective is short, not physically impressive in any way, and will have to think his way out of these problems. And I think that'll set that series apart from other detective series. And I'm having fun with it so far, but I don't have it completed yet.
Understand. Well, we will have to leave it at that for today. Steve, thanks very much for coming in today. It has been a pleasure to catch up with you, my friend.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, Carl. I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me.
Please tell Jerry I said hello.
Will do.
And that's going to be it for today. I will be back in a second to put a bow on this week's podcast. And please, until then, remember what Mark Twain said. If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. Back in a minute.